Welcome, my friends, to the Campfire, and thank you for taking the time to join me tonight as we dive into an hour of spine-chilling tales. Your presence here means the world to me, and I hope these stories send the perfect shiver down your spine. If you enjoy this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of horror, and subscribe for even more Campfire tales. Your support helps keep the fire burning, and there's always room for one more around the flames. Now, let's begin. Title: The Reflection in the Glass. The first time I saw it, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was late, way past the hour when rational thoughts can still hold sway. The antique mirror in the corner of my room seemed to draw the moonlight in, feeding off its silvery glow until it shivered, as if alive. The glass was cracked, the lines splintering like veins, a fine web that traced patterns I couldn't make sense of. It was beautiful and grotesque, an invitation masked as a warning. I should have thrown it out. I should have listened to the chill that pricked my skin every time I passed it. Should have ignored the shiver that raced down my spine. But when I looked at it, I felt a pull, as if the mirror was breathing, pulling me in with every beat of my heart. The first night I stood in front of it, brushing my hair, I heard it. It was so quiet at first, a whisper so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then it grew, a thin thread of sound that snaked its way through the silence, growing louder with each breath. Come closer. I spun, my hand clutching the edge of the dresser, eyes scanning the room as if the voice could be hiding behind the curtains. Nothing. Only the hollow shadows stretching across the floor, jagged and cruel. My breath came quick and shallow, the kind that comes when your body is too close to terror and refuses to admit it. But I couldn't look away. The mirror seemed to shimmer, like water disturbed by a sudden touch. The figure staring back at me was mine, but not quite. Its eyes were too wide, hollowed out in a way that made my stomach twist. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, the corners splitting with unnatural ease until it looked like it would swallow its own face. I took a step back, gasping as the cold air scraped at my skin. The voice came again, deeper, more guttural. Come closer. My heart pounded against my ribs, my chest tightening as I stumbled backward. But the pull was irresistible. It was like my feet had a will of their own, stepping forward until I was pressed against the cold, cracked glass. I reached out, fingers trembling, and the mirror rippled as if it were liquid. The surface sucked my hand in, icy fingers grazing my skin, pulling me into a world where shadows danced and eyes watched from every corner. The whispers grew, louder and clearer, like hundreds of voices overlapping into one deafening roar. Help us. Set us free. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. My reflection didn't move when I moved. It tilted its head, eyes locked onto mine, and the grin spread wider, high, as if it were mocking me. I stumbled away, slamming into the wall, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears. The house was silent again. Too silent. I pressed my back to the wall, hands slick with sweat, heart racing like a caged animal. And then I heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the mirror, now no longer reflecting the room, but a hallway that stretched into darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that my fear was feeding on itself, twisting the world around me. But deep down, I knew better. The air was colder now, and with every step toward the mirror, the air grew thicker, smothering, suffocating. Before I could think, the whisper came again, as clear as a scream. Help us. My voice cracked when I spoke. What do you want? The figure in the mirror moved. It stretched, fingers like blackened roots reaching for me. I staggered backward, eyes wide with terror. It was no longer just a distorted reflection. It was reaching out, clawing through the surface, breaking the boundary between this world and the one trapped within that glass prison. I backed away, breath ragged, eyes never leaving the mirror. But then, the whisper grew louder, surrounding me, filling my mind, a cacophony that threatened to split it apart. Set us free. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and I turned just in time to see the first of them step through the mirror. It was a grotesque version of me, its skin peeling and pale, hollow eyes that glistened with a malice I couldn't comprehend. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was a wet, choking rasp, as if it had been drowning for years. The next reflection pushed through, then another, each one more twisted than the last. They came, feet dragging, fingers reaching, mouths open in silent agony, their eyes screaming for something I couldn't give. I backed away, tripping over the rug, landing hard on the floor. No, 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 I whispered, crawling backward, desperate to put distance between myself and the unholy figures now emerging from the mirror. One of them reached out, a finger that ended in a jagged, broken nail. It touched my arm, and pain exploded through me like fire. I screamed, my skin blistering beneath its touch, black marks spreading like veins of a poison plant. My vision blurred, and the room spun. The whispers surged to a deafening roar, seeping into my mind and tearing it apart. "Help us," they chanted, the chorus of my twisted selves closing in. "Set us free." I clawed at the floor, trying to find purchase, but the room was a living, pulsing thing full of teeth and hands and eyes. The figures circled me, their mouths open, their breath fetid and cold, carrying the stench of decay. One of them stepped forward, its mouth gaping, and I recognized the voice that had called to me from the start. It was mine. "Set us free," I whispered, the words slipping from my lips like a plea. The figure's eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition before the mouth stretched into a grin that threatened to split its face. I reached out, fingers numb, and touched the mirror, feeling the cold seep into my veins. The world tilted, the glass pulling me in, cracking around me, sharp shards cutting through my skin. I screamed as the darkness closed in, swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw was my reflection, the version of me that had always been there, standing in the shattered frame, eyes hollow and pleading. And then, nothing. When I woke, the room was still, too quiet. The mirror was whole again, a perfect reflection of my shaking, wide-eyed self. But when I reached out, the glass didn't feel cold. It felt warm, alive. And behind me, the whispers began again. "Help us. Set us free." They were inside me now, buried beneath my skin, tangled in my blood. They were me, and I was them. The mirror had taken me, and now I was the one who whispered, trapped in the reflection, waiting for someone else to come close enough to hear. And the dark, endless night waited with me, patient and cruel. The whispering shadows. The first time I saw the house, I knew it was wrong. It loomed at the edge of Black Hollow like an ancient, twisted monument to suffering. The skeletal trees around it caked in frost that glittered like shards of glass. Its shutters hung at angles that mocked the idea of symmetry, creaking in the wind with a sound so ragged it almost seemed to whisper my name. I'd heard the stories, the drunken ramblings at the pub where old men with sunken cheeks spoke of curses and the house that was never empty. I scoffed at them, too young and too proud to give such tales credence. That was until the night I found myself standing in front of it, the cold biting through my coat and a hollow pit of dread gnawing at my gut. The fog was thick, winding around my legs like 100 unseen serpents. It slithered over my boots, tugging at me, making each step feel like a battle against an invisible weight. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, steam curling up and vanishing into the gloom. I felt it, something dark and alive, watching, waiting. The hollow eyes of the windows seemed to glare at me, two sockets full of secrets, until a fleeting shadow crossed one, so quick it might have been my mind playing tricks. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as if I'd swallowed sand. The wind picked up, a mournful, keening wail that seemed to emanate from the house itself, urging me closer. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the iron handle cold as a grave, sending a shiver up my spine. The door creaked open with a sound so sharp it could have cut through bone. Darkness poured out, gushing like oil and swallowing the world whole. The air inside was thick, heavier than the fog, and carried the scent of rotting wood and something worse, something sharp and metallic that made my stomach churn. I reached for my flashlight, fingers shaking as I twisted it on. The beam sputtered, flickering like a dying breath, throwing jagged pools of light that painted the peeling walls in ghostly relief. Shapes shifted in the corners, seething and shifting like a living nightmare. "Hello?" my voice echoed, thin and brittle, but the silence returned it with an unnatural weight. The echoes seemed to hang in the air as if waiting for something else to answer. Then came the first sound, so slight at first I thought I imagined it, a whisper, thin as a breath, the voice of a spirit. But it was more than a voice. It was a million voices, layered and layered, breathing together in a dissonant chorus that made my skin crawl. "Get out!" The whisper came from behind me, the air crackling with static as I spun around. Shadows coalesced and slithered in the corners, twisting into shapes that were wrong, broken. A figure stepped forward, its limbs bent in ways that no human form should ever be able to. The skin was a mosaic of gaping wounds, black ichor oozing from the cracks, and its eyes, pits of soulless void, fixed on me, frozen in a grim, knowing stare. I choked, the scream clawing at my throat as I stumbled backward into the hallway. The whispers swelled, louder now, layered with anguish, begging, clawing at my sanity. Leave this place. Leave us. The beam of my flashlight flickered and died, then sparked back to life, casting terrifying shadows that seemed to twist and reach. I fumbled with it, desperately trying to keep it focused as I ran, but the darkness seemed alive, pressing against my chest, tightening my breath. I hit the staircase, the wood splintering beneath my feet, and glanced behind me. The creature had moved, its grotesque form unfolding, the broken joints of its limbs bending in a terrible dance. Its mouth split open in a grin that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were blackened and cracked. Its head tilted, and a sharp, bone-chilling sound erupted from its throat. A laugh, sharp and guttural, that made my blood turn to ice. I forced myself up the stairs, 3 at a time, every footfall an echo that was quickly swallowed by the shadows below. The whispers grew more desperate, more frenzied, as though the house itself was screaming for me to leave. I reached the top of the stairs, the floor slick with moisture. Shapes emerged from the gloom, figures twisted and mutilated, their eyes voids that sucked the light. A woman draped in black, her veil soaked in blood, reached out with skeletal fingers that twisted like roots, pulling at the air, pulling at me. The voices became a singular, deafening chorus, a scream that vibrated through my very bones. Set us free, please, set us free. I stumbled into a room at the end of the hallway, the door swinging open with a shriek that cut through the cacophony. Moonlight streamed through a broken window, catching on something impossible. A hole, black as pitch, had torn open the center of the floor, a wound that breathed in the cold night air. I stood there, frozen, the whispers swirling around me like a storm. The creature followed, the limbs contorting and cracking as it emerged, its mouth now wider than its face, a void that seemed to drink in the light, the air, the sanity around it. I stumbled back, eyes wide with terror as the room grew colder, a frost spreading out from the darkness. A voice, familiar and broken, whispered in my ear, too close, too real. Set us free. I felt myself being pulled, the ground shifting beneath me, as the whispers grew into a roar that drowned out my thoughts. The floor cracked, splintered into a jagged grin that swallowed me whole. I reached for the door, for the hallway, but the creatures were there, their cold, brittle fingers digging into my skin, pulling me into the void. When I awoke, the morning light spilled through the cracked window, pale and lifeless. I sat up, gasping, my body trembling, but the room was still. The silence should have been comforting, but the whispers were still there, resonating inside my skull like the echoes of those who could not leave. Help us. Set us free. The house stood silent, but I was no longer outside of it. I was trapped, part of its wickedness, my voice joining the chorus of the damned. And I knew, deep in my marrow, that the whispers would never stop. They would call, always call, until someone answered. And I was already lost. The House of Echoes. The first time I laid eyes on the house at the end of Wicker Lane, I knew it was wrong. It stood with its broken bones exposed, like the corpse of some ancient beast, its shutters flapping as though the wind was trying to force its way inside, whispering secrets I could almost hear. The stories were everywhere, stories of the Mather family that vanished, of strange lights flickering in the windows, of the blood-curdling screams that could be heard when the wind blew just right. But I never believed the stories, not until that night. The night I came to stand before it, my mind numbed by whiskey and the aching need for something more. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was colder than it had any right to be, pricking at my skin with a biting, unnatural chill. The fog was thick and wet, crawling around my boots like a living thing, coiling around my ankles, pulling me closer to the house. "Get out!" the wind whispered, its voice thin and sharp. I froze, every muscle in my body locking tight, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes watching me, eyes that peeled away at my sanity. A sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness, and for just a moment I thought I saw them. Dozens of pale, emaciated faces peering out from behind shattered windows, eyes hollow and black, mouths twisted in silent, pleading screams. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Get out!" The voice came again, more insistent, more desperate this time. I ran, the sound of my feet pounding on the old wooden planks, the echoes of my fear chasing me into the house. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, splinters biting into my fingers. Darkness swallowed me whole. The air inside was colder, heavy with the scent of damp and decay, as though the house had been rotting for decades, feeding off the misery it had witnessed. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam was weak, sputtering like an old man gasping for air. The flickering light painted grotesque shapes on the peeling wallpaper, shadows that seemed to shift and move. The house sighed, an old, breathless moan that resonated in my bones, and then I heard it, soft, faint, like a whisper from a grave. "Help us. Set us free." My skin prickled with icy terror, and I spun around, my heart beating so loud it threatened to burst from my chest. The hallway stretched out in front of me, its walls cracked and bowed, as if some great force had once tried to break its way through. My feet took me forward, though every part of me screamed to run. I should have run. A sudden shuffling behind me made me jump. I spun, the light cutting across the room, illuminating the outline of a figure standing in the shadows. It was a child, its body twisted and broken in ways that defied reason, the eyes black pits that stared into me with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. Its mouth opened, and the sound that came out was a low, keening wail that made my blood freeze. "Why did you come?" it whispered, voice as sharp and jagged as broken glass. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on a pile of old, mildewed blankets. I fell hard, pain shooting up my spine, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, the whispers now all around me, more voices layering over each other, chattering in a language I didn't know, their tone guttural and hungry. "Help us. Set us free." The floor buckled under me, a low, rolling groan as though the house itself were in agony. The walls seemed to twist, warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend, images of hands reaching out, pale fingers clawing at the air. A shadow lunged toward me, and I screamed, the sound raw and primal as I ducked out of its way. I ran to the stairs, the banister splintered and twisted, its paint peeling away like skin. The second I set foot on the first step, the house screamed. An ear-splitting, bone-rattling noise that made me drop my flashlight. The darkness surged toward me like a wave, and I felt icy fingers brush the back of my neck. I scrambled up the stairs, my hands slick with sweat, heart pounding as if it would burst. The hallway above was worse. The shadows shifted and pulled themselves together, forming shapes that moved in and out of the corners of my vision. I felt the cold press of unseen eyes, the weight of their gaze clinging to me. I could almost hear them, the whispers turning into guttural, low growls. "Help us. Set us free." I reached the end of the hallway, where a door hung on its hinges, splintered and bent. The voices had become louder, an overwhelming cacophony of pleading and fury. I pushed the door open, my fingers numb with terror, and stumbled into the room. It was a nursery, with toys scattered across the floor, their paint chipped and eyes dull. The cradle in the center rocked on its own, creaking with a rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as I did, the baby's laughter erupted, high and sharp, piercing the room. The light flickered and went out, leaving me in total blackness. The laughter grew, other voices joining in, a chorus of children's voices, mocking and cruel. A hand grabbed mine, cold and clammy, its fingers like bone. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked by the pressure of something against my throat, something that moved in the dark, something that slithered and writhed. "Set us free," it rasped, the voice wet and deep, like the sound of drowning. I fell to my knees, the room spinning, the whispers reaching a fever pitch, drowning out my thoughts. The air was thick, sharp with the taste of iron. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I reached out in desperation. I could hear them now, the voices from the past, the agony, the pleading, the sharp sounds of death and despair. And then, silence. Dead. Suffocating silence that pressed in on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I looked up, but there was nothing. No shadow, no sound. Just me in the nursery, the toys staring at me, their painted smiles a cruel joke. My fingers touched the cradle and it stopped moving. Everything went still, and then I saw her. The woman in black. Her eyes were hollow, black holes that seemed to pull my soul inside them. She reached for me, and in that moment, I knew I had become a part of the house, another voice among the chorus, another face in the shadows. The whispers returned, not just around me, but within me, their icy fingers tangled in my mind. Set us free. The house that hushed me. I don't remember when I first noticed that something was wrong. Days blended into one another like a sick, feverish dream, a gray wash of emptiness that held me in its cold, suffocating grip. When I woke, the oppressive silence surrounded me like a shroud, each breath dragging me deeper into a darkness I couldn't name. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it was just fatigue, just the weariness of a mind stretched thin. But I was lying to myself, and deep down, I knew it. It wasn't until that day, the day when I heard the footsteps, that I knew I had to confront the truth. I stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up at the cracked banister and the flickering gaslight that sputtered in its cage, casting grotesque, twisting shadows across the hallway. The house breathed around me, creaking, sighing as though it were alive. A chill slithered up my spine, and the whisper of movement from above made my blood turn cold. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice a thin, shaking thread in the suffocating silence. Nothing but the sound of my heartbeat, a thunderous drum in my ears. But then it came, faint, like the scraping of bone on glass, a shuffle of footsteps that seemed to circle the upstairs, coming closer, then retreating. I flinched, pressing my back against the wall as the hallway seemed to stretch and bend before me. The air was thick, suffocating, tangy with the metallic scent of rust, and something else I couldn't name, a putrid smell, like decay. The first time I felt it was then, an invisible weight pressing against my chest, a suffocating grip that stole my breath. I forced myself to move, one step, then another, my feet creaking across the floorboards. A low groan shuddered from deep within the house, and the floor trembled beneath me as if in warning. "Hello?" I whispered again, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I didn't want to know who. The shadow at the top of the stairs flitted, a shape with no substance, slithering and coiling. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't look away. It twisted and dripped, as if made of ink that had been scorched into motion, dark limbs that seemed to move on their own, not bound by bone or flesh. Its eyes, hollow pits in the void of its face, bore into me. My breath caught, the air thickening in my throat, and for the first time, I understood. I was being hunted. I ran, the floorboards snapping and popping beneath my feet as I bolted through the hallway, my chest burning, my limbs weak. The footsteps behind me were faster now, closing in, as if a dozen feet were chasing me, their rhythm a twisted chorus that mocked my terror. I glanced back to see a figure at the edge of the hallway, an impossibility, limbs too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle, mouth gaping in a soundless scream. I stumbled and fell against the old splintered chair, the wood biting into my palm as I pushed myself upright. My vision blurred with tears as I reached for the light switch, fingers slick and trembling. The bulb flickered, died, and came back to life, casting my reflection in a fractured dance of light and shadow. I froze. I was no longer alone. There, behind me in the dark, was me, my reflection, but not. Hollow eyes stared back at me, the corners of my mouth stretched into a grin that I had never worn. It moved when I moved, its grin growing wider with every heartbeat. The whispers, low and guttural, began again. They came from everywhere, from the walls, the floorboards, from deep inside my head. The voice of the house, ancient and seething, weaving words I couldn't comprehend. "Help me." It wasn't just a voice. It was a chorus, voices echoing one after another, twisting and turning, speaking in a language that cut into my mind. I screamed, the sound piercing through the suffocating silence and shattering the room. The reflection moved, reaching out, fingers long and cracked, scraping the glass, leaving dark streaks behind. I spun around, trying to flee, but the hallway had changed. The walls were closer now, leaning in like they were made of flesh, wet and pulsing. The floor roiled beneath me, undulating like a living thing. I ran, the house a labyrinth of corners that bent impossibly, hallways that led nowhere, doors that opened into more darkness. And then I saw it. A door, just a door, but it was different. It hummed with a wrongness that made my skin crawl. I reached for it, fingers trembling as I twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a room that felt like it had never seen light. Inside, the air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sharp and acrid. The walls were lined with mirrors, cracked and broken, reflections shivering and writhing as if alive. But I wasn't alone in the room. My reflection stood in the center, staring at me with hollow, wet eyes. The smile on its face stretched wider, impossibly so, until it split the skin and showed teeth, black and jagged. "Set us free," it whispered, its voice matching the chorus I heard in the hallway. The echoes of past voices joined in, an agonizing, relentless wail that drowned out my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. The whispers shifted, sharpening, rising, turning into a chorus of anguish. The mirrors quivered as something moved inside them, shifting, reshaping. Faces that looked like mine, only with eyes that leaked black, reached out with hands made of cracked glass. I screamed again, but this time there was no sound. The room tilted, spun, and I was falling. The floor disappeared, and I was plunged into darkness. I reached out, fingers scrabbling at nothingness as the cold, wet embrace of something unseen wrapped around me. It whispered into my ear, the voice wet and cold, and I recognized it. "You never left." I woke, or I thought I did, as the morning light seeped through the cracks in the boards. My limbs were numb, my head throbbing, but the whispers were still there, still crawling through my mind, slithering over my thoughts. The shadows were deeper now, more alive. My eyes found the mirror in the corner, and I saw it, my reflection, but not. It smiled, a grin that pulled and twisted the skin, and the darkness behind it seemed to thrum with anticipation. The whispers reached a crescendo, and I understood. I would never leave, because the house had claimed me, and now I was part of it, a voice in the chorus of the damned. And I knew that the whispers would never stop, that I would never be alone. Not now, not ever. Echoes of the unseen. I can't tell you when it started. I wish I could, so I could put the blame on a certain day, a certain moment when everything fell apart. But it crept in, a shadow slithering behind me, until it was a part of my very being. It came softly, with the breeze that whispered through the cracks of my old house, as if trying to tell me secrets I wasn't ready to hear. The first time I thought I heard it, I blamed exhaustion. I was always working late, eyes straining in the glow of my laptop, willing words to come, pleading with the silence to break. It wasn't until the night of the first real scream that I knew something was wrong. It came from the hallway just outside my bedroom, a sound so piercing and full of agony that it felt like my heart had been torn from my chest. I jumped out of bed, my bare feet slapping the cold wooden floor as I rushed to the door. The hallway was empty. The only light came from the pale moon slipping through the cracked blinds, casting long, thin bars across the floor. "Hello?" My voice quavered, but there was no response, only silence so deep it felt alive, like something was watching, waiting, breathing. I crept out, stepping lightly, the hairs on my neck standing as if touched by an unseen hand. I don't know what I expected to see, but the air was heavy, pressing in around me, suffocating. The floorboards moaned with each step, whispering their own complaints. As I reached the foot of the stairs, the chill grew sharper, like the breath of a corpse brushing past me. I shivered, the sudden cold seeping into my bones, making me want to turn and run. And then I heard it again, a whisper, low and guttural, slipping through the house like the caress of a knife. "Help me." It was a voice that cracked and bled, one that clawed at my sanity. I froze, the blood in my veins like ice. "Who's there?" I whispered, but the only answer was the sound of my own heartbeat. Wild and frantic. The whisper grew louder, morphing into a chorus, thin and stretched, every voice breaking and raw. I stumbled backward into the living room, the old armchair creaking beneath me as I fell. The fire in the hearth had died hours ago, leaving only the dark, yawning room, its corners shrouded in shadows that seemed to shift and reach out to me. A scraping sound came from the hallway, nails dragging over wood, slow and deliberate. I felt it before I saw it. A presence, something behind me, in the deep, clawed blackness that swallowed the house. I turned, my breath lodged in my throat as I met the gaze of a figure standing in the hallway, eyes hollow and wet, and a smile too wide to be human. It raised an arm that bent at the wrong angle, fingers splayed and twitching as if they were trying to reach for something just out of their grasp. "Please," it whispered again, Bess, the sound wet and desperate. It took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath its weight. and I could see it now. The jagged, torn edges of its clothing, the patches of skin that had been flayed away to reveal bone beneath. My blood turned to lead as I realized it was moving toward me, the edges of its form blurring as if it were made of smoke and bone. "Get out," I managed to croak. My voice was swallowed by the rush of whispers, the thousands of voices that rose from the dark, filling the space until the walls trembled. The figure opened its mouth, and inside it was a black void, deeper than the night. I could feel it pulling at my sanity, at my mind, like a force trying to drag me in. I ran, every nerve screaming as I dashed for the front door. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel something cold grabbing at my ankles, tripping me, dragging me back. I fell hard, the wooden floor biting into my palms. When I looked up, the hallway was alive, shifting and bending. A black ocean that roiled and seethed, eyes and mouths forming and dissolving, reaching for me with limbs that had no right to exist. The whispers had turned into screams, and each one was louder than the last, clawing at my sanity, tearing at the fabric of reality. "Set us free," they screamed, the sound so raw it left my ears ringing. I crawled backward, my vision blurring with tears as I reached for the door, fingers scrabbling for the cold brass handle. It slipped through my fingers, and the room seemed to spin as the air grew heavier, pressing down until my chest ached and my breath came in ragged gasps. And then it was silent. One moment, the cacophony of screams and whispers, and the next, nothing but the echo of my own ragged breathing. I hesitated, my chest trembling as I looked around. The hallway was empty, save for the figure standing at the far end. It tilted its head, the smile widening until I could see the jagged teeth that filled its mouth, the eyes now burning with an unholy light. "Leave," it said, and the whisper was soft and almost tender, but it carried the weight of an eternity of suffering beyond comprehension. I ran again, this time down the stairs, my feet slipping on the smooth wood, hitting the ground with bone-jarring force. I couldn't stop, couldn't let the darkness catch me. I reached the front door, fingers numb as I fumbled with the lock. The sounds of shuffling feet, scraping nails, and wet, gasping breaths followed me, their echoes reverberating through my skull until I thought I might go mad. The door swung open, and I stumbled outside into the brittle cold of the early morning. The whispers followed, still there, swirling around me like a storm. I turned, expecting to see the figure there in the dark, but the house stood silent, its windows black and empty. I ran, far away from that house and the voices that haunted it, but I could still hear them, still feel them gnawing at the edges of my mind, whispering, always whispering, "Set us free." It's been months, but I still hear them, no matter where I go. The whispers, the laughter, the tears. I can feel them in the dark, their cold breath against my neck, their desperate pleading, and I know deep in the marrow of my bones that they will never leave, and neither will I. The house has marked me, and now I am bound to it, part of the endless chorus of the damned, forever trapped in a waking nightmare. The silence between us. I had never believed in ghosts. I scoffed at the idea, dismissing it of tired minds and overactive imaginations. The cracks in my apartment's walls and the creaks of the wooden floors were just the sounds of an old building settling. That was until the night I heard the whispers. Soft, impossibly close, like a breath on the back of my neck. The first time I heard it, I told myself I was imagining it. The sound came when I was alone in the living room, curled into a threadbare blanket, eyes glued to the flickering screen of my TV. The city outside was alive with noise, siren wails, the screech of tires, shouts that grew and died in the distance. It was the kind of noise that should drown out everything, yet there it was, a voice, ragged and broken. Not alone. My body froze as the words slithered across my skin. The TV flickered, a sharp jolt of static that pricked at my senses. I turned to the window, peering through the glass at the world beyond. The lights of the city flickered like dying stars, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the glass, staring back at me with hollow eyes. "Who's there?" My voice sounded fragile, too thin against the oppressive silence. No answer. The apartment seemed to sigh, the walls vibrating as if in anticipation. I stumbled to my feet, heart thundering in my chest. I needed to get out. I needed fresh air, anything to break this suffocating grip. I reached for the front door, fingers trembling as I fumbled with the lock, but a noise from behind made me stop. a sound like dry leaves rustling, sharp and crackling. I spun around, eyes wide, breath hitching in my throat. The hallway was dark, but I could see it, something moving. It shifted, a slow, sinuous movement that was too fluid to be human. It had no face, but I felt its gaze pierce me, cold and suffocating. The lights overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls, reaching out with dark fingers. My pulse quickened, each beat louder than the thundering in my ears. "I need to leave," I whispered, but the voice came from somewhere else, somewhere inside me. It was not my own. The hallway whispered back, a voice that was more breath than sound. "No, you can't." The darkness moved, coiling and slipping between the cracks of the walls like ink spilled across a page. I lunged for the door, but my vision blurred. The air thickened, tasting of iron and decay. I gasped, trying to fill my lungs, but they only dragged in more of that suffocating, oily blackness. A sound like a distant, guttural growl pulled me up short. It came from inside the room, right behind me, and suddenly I knew what it was. A presence. It pressed against my back, impossibly cold, as if death itself had taken hold of me. "Please." I choked, the word barely a plea. The walls around me seemed to close in, the plaster cracking as if the building were screaming. The whisper was louder now, a chorus of agonized voices layered over each other, each one pulling me deeper into a sea of terror. "Leave. Leave now, before it sees you." I spun to face the hallway, but there was nothing there, only a void that seemed to shudder, a dark, living thing just waiting to devour me. The floor beneath my feet cracked and splintered, the wood peeling away in jagged lines that resembled claw marks. A sickening wet sound followed, and I froze, eyes wide as a shadow began to take shape, crawling from the cracks in the wall. It was no longer just a shadow. It had form, a shape that twisted like a puppet with broken strings. It moved toward me, limbs bending at impossible angles, fingers ending in black talons that scraped the floor, leaving behind lines of wet, inky residue. My scream erupted, unbidden and raw, as I stumbled backward. The creature's face was a mask of nothingness, hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch beyond reason, dripping with something dark and viscous. "You came back," it rasped, and its voice was like rusted metal against the ears, dragging at my sanity. "But you never left." I stumbled, feet catching on the edge of the rug, and I fell, slamming hard into the floor. The room spun, the dark shape looming over me, its fingers reaching down, skittering across the floorboards like insects. "Help me," I whispered, but it wasn't enough to keep me from the abyss. The creature reached for me, and the cold was immediate, like plunging into ice water. It grabbed my face, the touch sharp and burning, as if my skin were being torn away. The darkness pressed in, drowning me in soundless screams and whispered curses. I clawed at the air, fingers scraping at the floor, desperate for purchase, but the cold seeped into my bones, and I felt the world slide away, the walls vanishing, the whispers swallowing my senses. "Stay with me," the voice hissed, and I knew that I'd never leave, never escape. The creature's laughter roared, a sound that filled the space between heartbeat and breath, and it echoed in the empty halls of my mind, a promise that I was now part of its dark, eternal prison. The silence between us grew. It was the last sound I heard as the world turned black, and I felt the cold reach deep inside, hollowing me out. The night of the doppelganger. I woke up late that morning, my alarm clock buzzing insistently beside the bed. It was strange. Yesterday felt like the end of something. But now, as I rubbed my eyes, it was as if I'd stepped into a new world where the rules didn't quite apply. My head was pounding from a restless sleep, and the light outside my window seemed just a bit too bright. My gaze fell on the small, rectangular mirror on the opposite wall. A part of me expected to see something unsettling, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection didn't just follow my movements as usual. It lagged, just for a split second, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I paused, studying it. My reflection mirrored my every motion. But when I moved my head slightly to the left, it stayed where it was for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. It was like my reflection wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was aware. I brushed it off as sleep deprivation. Maybe I was just tired, still caught between the haze of sleep and waking. I went through my morning routine as usual, splashing cold water on my face and staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. This time, it was more noticeable. The second I stepped back from the sink, my reflection didn't just copy me. It smiled, a slow, creeping grin that wasn't mine. I froze, my hand still resting on the edge of the sink. The smile on my reflection's face was wrong. It wasn't just a smile, it was something else, something too knowing, as if it was aware of something I wasn't. I immediately stepped back, my heart pounding, but my reflection stayed frozen in that bizarre smile, unblinking. I looked away, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. When I returned to the mirror a few moments later, the smile was gone. The reflection was normal again. But it wasn't. Not really. Over the next few days, things became more unsettling. At first, it was just little things. My reflection no longer just mirrored my movements. It started doing things I didn't do. Small things, like raising its hand a split second before I did, or moving its fingers in a way that seemed slightly off. It became more than a delayed reaction. It became like a parallel version of me, acting independently, but still I could almost convince myself it was nothing more than tiredness or stress. Then came the first time it really scared me. I had been sitting in my living room, reading a book on the couch, when I glanced over to the wall-mounted mirror in the hallway. My reflection, visible from where I sat, was standing perfectly still, just staring at the mirror with an empty expression on its face. I blinked, momentarily confused, and then I realized something horrifying. My real self was sitting on the couch, not standing in front of the mirror. My reflection was standing, motionless, staring at the glass, like it was waiting for something. I stood up, my heart racing, and the second I moved, my reflection's posture snapped back to a normal stance, mirroring my actions perfectly. But I knew what I had seen. It had been standing there without me. It was almost as if it had a life of its own, independent of me. The longer I stared, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The following day, things escalated even further. I woke up late again and went through my usual routine. But when I glanced at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I saw something even more disturbing. My reflection wasn't mimicking me. It was looking at me, studying me. Its eyes were wide open, staring right into mine, but its expression was different this time. It looked more alive, more conscious. And then it did something I hadn't done. It raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and beckoned to me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The hand movement was unmistakable. It wasn't a glitch or a trick of the light. My reflection was calling to me. The urge to reach out to it, to touch the glass and answer its silent invitation was overwhelming, but I resisted, pulling away from the mirror and backing out of the bathroom in a panic. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the mirror on my dresser. I swear I saw something move in the reflection, but when I turned around, there was nothing behind me. The mirror reflected only the darkness of the room. I turned my head again, this time with more urgency, and there it was. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. But I wasn't moving. I stood frozen in the mirror, my reflection standing still as though waiting for me to do something. But when I moved, it didn't follow. I was no longer in sync with my own image. It was still, waiting. The longer I stared, the more I felt like something was lurking just behind the reflection, something trying to step out of the glass. The fear grew with every passing day. I started seeing it in places it shouldn't be. I was getting ready for work one morning when I noticed in the reflection of the microwave's glass door, my reflection standing in the kitchen. I glanced over. There was no one there. I looked back. It was still there, standing motionless behind me, staring with those other eyes. I turned my head. Nothing. But I could feel it. The presence in the glass, something waiting to emerge. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The reflection, no longer mine. It had taken on a life of its own, a life I didn't understand. It wasn't until the night I came home late from work that I realized how far it had gone. I opened the door to my apartment, expecting the usual silence, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. In the hallway mirror, there was no reflection of me. There was only the figure that had once been my own image, but now it stood taller, its eyes glowing, its features twisted into something sinister. I stepped closer, barely breathing. It moved as I did. But when I looked at the door, I saw my real self standing right in front of it. The reflection didn't move with me. It stood there, unmoving, smiling, its grin wide, its eyes unblinking. Then it spoke. "Well, well, well," the reflection said, its voice deep and unfamiliar. "You've been avoiding me for far too long." I felt my blood turn cold. The voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was hollow, empty, like an echo of something that wasn't me anymore. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm you," it replied, its lips curling into that horrible, mocking smile. Or at least I was. Before I could react, it stepped out of the mirror. It was real now, standing in front of me, just as tall, just as wrong. I backed away in horror, my heart hammering in my chest. It tilted its head, studying me, its grin widening. "You're not needed anymore," it said. "It's time for you to leave." And before I could run, it lunged at me. I woke up the next morning, no mirror in sight, just the feeling of something missing. The apartment felt empty, quieter. I looked around frantic, but there was nothing, except for the reflection in the window. It was me, but it wasn't. The forgotten phone call. It started with a phone call. Late one night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand. I groaned and reached for it, squinting at the screen. The caller ID was blank, no number, no name, just an empty space. I should have let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out, as it often does late at night when the world feels more surreal. "Hello?" I said groggily. At first, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through, a woman's voice, soft and trembling. Is this me?" she asked. I sat up in bed, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. "What? Who is this?" The static grew louder, swallowing her voice for a moment. When it cleared, she spoke again, her tone pleading. "Don't go there, please. Promise me you won't." "Go where? Who are you?" I demanded, my heart starting to race, but the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was a prank call, I told myself. A weird one, sure, but still just a joke. I should have forgotten about it. I should have laughed it off. But the unease lingered, curling in my chest like a shadow that refused to fade. The next day, the call was still on my mind. At work, I replayed it over and over in my head, the woman's voice etched into my memory. Is this me? What kind of question was that? And the way she'd said, "Don't go there." It felt personal, urgent, like she knew me. That evening, as I walked home from the bus stop, I felt a strange pull. My usual route took me down a quiet street lined with houses and old trees, but tonight something compelled me to turn left instead of right, leading me toward the edge of town. I didn't know why I did it. It felt almost like instinct, like my feet were moving of their own accord. The road I found myself on was unfamiliar, narrower than I expected, and flanked by dense woods. The streetlights were sparse, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. I checked my phone, but the GPS refused to load. The signal bar blinked out. Still, I kept walking, the pull growing stronger with every step. Eventually, I reached an old, dilapidated building at the end of the road. It looked abandoned. Its windows were shattered, the paint peeling from its walls like dead skin. A single flickering bulb above the doorway provided the only light. As I stood there, staring at the building, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out of my pocket, half expecting another blank caller ID. But this time, it wasn't a call. It was a text message. "Don't go inside." My breath caught in my throat. The sender was unknown, the number untraceable. My heart pounded as I looked up at the building again. The door creaked open, as if inviting me in. A chill ran down my spine, but against all reason I stepped forward. The air inside was thick and damp, smelling of mildew and something metallic like rust or blood. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have, the walls warped and covered in strange, dark stains. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one louder than the last. And then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It sounded like my name. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't go." It was the same voice from the phone call. I spun around, but the hallway behind me was empty. Panic surged through me, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, as if something unseen was holding me in place. The light overhead flickered, casting the hallway into momentary darkness. When the light returned, I wasn't alone anymore. A figure stood at the end of the hall, shrouded in shadow. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, heavy and cold. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. "Who are you?" I whispered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward me, its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The closer it got, the more I could feel it. A presence, ancient and malevolent, pressing against my mind like icy fingers. And then it spoke in a voice that wasn't quite human. A voice that sounded like mine. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. But the hallway had changed. It was no longer empty. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of me. In one, I was older, my face gaunt and hollow, my eyes sunken with despair. In another, I was younger, smiling brightly, but the smile didn't reach my eyes. In the last mirror, the most terrifying of all, I wasn't human at all. My face was twisted, my skin pale and cracked like porcelain, my eyes black pits that oozed darkness. I reached out to touch the nearest mirror, and the glass rippled beneath my fingers like water. My reflection moved closer, stepping toward me even though I hadn't moved. Its lips curled into a sinister grin. "You belong here now," it said. I yanked my hand back, the glass solidifying once more. The whispering started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. The voices overlapped, blending into a cacophony of terror. "Don't go. Stay. You'll never leave." I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endless, the walls closing in around me, the whispers growing louder and louder until they were a deafening roar. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the building was gone. There was nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds. My phone buzzed again. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and looked at the screen. "You didn't listen." The message was from my own number. I stared at it, my mind racing. I dropped the phone and stumbled to my feet, running as fast as I could back toward the main road. When I finally made it home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, shaking. But the nightmare wasn't over. Every time I look in the mirror now, I see something else. Something watching me from just beyond the glass. Waiting. The house at the edge of the woods. They told me not to go near the house. Every small town has its urban legends, but the old white clapboard house at the edge of our town's woods wasn't just a legend. It was a warning. Kids dared each other to touch its door or peek through its boarded windows, but no one ever stayed long. For years, it was easy to ignore the stories, chalk them up to small-town paranoia. But one night, everything changed. I'd been out late, taking the long way home through the woods after a fight with my girlfriend, when I found myself standing in front of it. I hadn't meant to come here. My feet just led me. The house loomed out of the dark, its edges blurred by the mist curling from the trees. Its windows were black eyes staring into the soul of the night. Its door slightly ajar like a mouth waiting to speak. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something about the way the door swayed in the gentle breeze, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within, drew me closer. The first thing that struck me as I approached was the silence. No crickets chirped, no wind whispered through the trees. It was as though the house had swallowed all sound, leaving only the hollow drumbeat of my heart in my ears. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my weight, and peered inside. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a dusty hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. It looked empty, but the air felt heavy, charged, like a storm about to break. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing back at me from the depths of the house. No response came, but something shifted in the air, like the house itself had heard me. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The hallway smelled of mildew and rot, the kind of damp decay that clings to forgotten places. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The floor creaked with each step. and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but the empty hallway stretching behind me. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, with a soft light glowing from within. My breath hitched. If the house had been abandoned for decades, as everyone said, there shouldn't have been any light. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The door creaked open as I nudged it with my foot, revealing a small room that didn't belong. The walls were clean, pristine even, painted a soft yellow that glowed warmly in the light of an old oil lamp on a table. A rocking chair sat in the corner, gently swaying even though there was no breeze. On the table was an old rotary phone, its cord snaking into the shadows. Something about the room felt wrong. It wasn't the anachronistic decor or the untouched cleanliness. It was the way the air in the room seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible sound. The phone rang. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The sound was sharp, jarring, cutting through the oppressive silence. My first instinct was to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It rang again, louder this time, like it was calling for me specifically. Slowly, against every ounce of common sense I possessed, I stepped forward and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I whispered. At first, there was nothing but static crackling faintly in my ear. Then a voice emerged, low, soft, and unmistakably mine. "Why did you come here?" it asked. My heart stopped. "Who is this?" "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I dropped the phone and stumbled back, my chest heaving. The room was silent again, but the low hum in the air had grown louder, more insistent, like the house was waking up. The rocking chair stopped moving. I fled the room, heart pounding as I sprinted back down the hallway. But something was wrong. The hall didn't end where it should have. The front door was gone, replaced by another stretch of decaying wallpaper and warped floorboards. Panic clawed at my throat as I ran, the walls seeming to stretch and twist around me. The air grew heavier with every step, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. Behind me, I heard the soft, deliberate creak of footsteps. I didn't dare look back. I stumbled into a new room, larger than the others, its walls lined with mirrors. The reflections weren't mine. In one mirror, I saw myself standing in the woods, pale and lifeless, my eyes staring blankly ahead. In another, I was in the house, but something shadowy loomed behind me, its spindly arms wrapped around my shoulders. The last mirror showed the room itself, but I wasn't in it. Instead, a figure stood where I should have been, tall, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The figure raised a hand, and the mirrors shattered. I woke up in the woods, lying on the damp ground. My flashlight was beside me, its beam weak and sputtering. The house was gone, replaced by a tangle of trees and underbrush. I told myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, but when I got home, I found dirt and splinters embedded in my palms. My shoes were caked with mud, and my clothes smelled of mildew. The nightmares started that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the house, running through its endless halls, the mirrors shattering behind me. And always I could hear the voice, my voice, whispering from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." Now, even when I'm awake, I catch glimpses of it in the corners of mirrors, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It's waiting. And I know deep down that one day it will take me back. And that concludes tonight's Tales by the Campfire. Thank you for spending this time with me and letting these stories be a part of your night. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends who love a good scare, and subscribe so you never miss the next gathering around the fire. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep the fire in your heart burning bright. I'll see you again soon.